Australia. We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? Give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On fuel, first the Prime Minister said there was no problem. Just days later, there was a crisis. Last week, the Prime Minister refused to cut the fuel excise in response to our call to slash the tax. Then just 1 hour ago, the Prime Minister finally announced a fuel excise cut. Why is the Prime Minister always the last to lead in a national crisis?
The call to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the latest Leader of the Opposition for his question.
Order. Order. The Minister for Infrastructure. Order. The Treasurer.
Everyone's talking about the interview.
The Minister for Climate Change. Order. When the House comes to order, we'll hear from the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I take from the question, which began by saying, firstly, that somehow the government and myself as Prime Minister didn't say there was an issue with fuel. Like, what, we didn't know that there was a war that has impacted the entire global fuel supply network. I mean, it's just beyond comprehension.
Order.
From the same group that came in here and actually asked a question one day, when will the war end, that they thought through in tactics, now pretends that somehow we on this side didn't acknowledge that there was a war and that it would have an impact, which it is, right around the world. What leadership is about is responding in a coherent, strategic, orderly way. And that is precisely what we have done, working with industry, working with state and territory governments, working through all of the issues, concentrating on the first issue, which is supply, making sure that we work with our international partners in the region. The announcement that we made on Sunday about shoring up supply, changing the standards of both petrol and diesel, so there was increased supply there as well, releasing in a coherent, orderly way 20% of the reserves, making sure that it got to where it was needed, and also working through on price, not an ill-thought-out proposal that said we're going to actually increase electricity prices by somehow doing something on fuel, but working it through so that, as well as the Commonwealth taking action, state and territory governments are taking action as well, making sure that we deal with the issue of the road user charge, reducing that to zero in recognition that particularly heavy vehicles are under enormous pressure. That is what good government looks like: orderly, coherent, making sure we look after our national interests, and that's precisely what we will continue to do.
The call to the honourable member for McEwen.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister update the House on the outcomes agreed at today's National Cabinet meeting and explain how those measures contribute to boosting Australia's fuel security and supply?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for McEwen for his question and for his ongoing issues in everything to do with fuels and motor vehicles as well. Today I convened after we had an NRC meeting, and after a Cabinet meeting we had our National Cabinet meeting. And there we endorsed the National Fuel Security Plan that we've been working on with states and territories in a coherent way across the board. Both Labor and Liberal National Party governments working in the national interest in a strategic way. Making sure as well that we plan and prepare was the first stage. The second stage, keeping Australia moving, because we don't want to find ourselves in a situation of what happened with COVID, of restrictions that are unnecessary. What we want to do is to make sure that the economy continues to function, make sure that people act responsibly as well. We repeat the message that people should only buy the fuel that they need, making voluntary choices to use less and avoid the impact as well of higher fuel prices. So we are at level 2. It's been agreed, the Commonwealth and State, we've set up the Fuel Supply Task Force with representatives of all state and territory governments working through the bureaucracy. The Minister for Energy is working through with his counterparts. The Treasurer is working through with his counterparts. The Agricultural Minister, the Transport Minister, all working through these issues to make sure that the very real global challenges which are there as a result of a war that can't be wished away and should be above some of the petty politics that we've seen across this chamber, that we work through in the national interest. Now, today we agreed that the Commonwealth would take immediate action to halve the fuel excise on petrol and diesel for 3 months starting this Wednesday. We'll reduce the heavy vehicle road user charge to 0 for 3 months, something that was not proposed by those opposite. And in addition to that, the fuel price will be reduced by more than that half reduction because we acknowledge that the GST would have produced a windfall gain for the states and territories as well. And they were cooperative about that as well, bringing them together through the National Cabinet process. The National Fuel Security Plan that has been established is important. We know this is a global crisis, but we also know that families, businesses and farmers are feeling and seeing the impacts at their local petrol station, which is why we continue to act on supply, but today have made these cost-of-living measures.
I'll give the call to the order. Members on my right, we'll have silence before the member is heard. The call goes to the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. An hour ago, the government followed the coalition and announced a fuel excise cut. Can the Treasurer confirm that, unlike the coalition's plan, there are no inflationary offset to the government's excise cut?
To the call. Order. The Minister for Infrastructure is now warned. This continual interjection when anyone's speaking is highly disorderly. I'm asking for her help and everyone's help to make sure that we show everyone respect. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You'd think with how long they gave him to come up with his first question in quite a while that he'd come up with a better question than that, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Let me tell the Shadow Treasurer the key difference.
Order.
Let me tell the Shadow Treasurer the key difference between the approach that we announced today and the letter that they wrote the Prime Minister, I think, on Friday. The main difference is, in the plan that we announced today, we didn't forget the heavy vehicle users like those opposite did. So those opposite called for a $1.5 billion change, which completely ignored the fact that heavy vehicles were paying 34 cents a litre. And that's how they came up with a costing of 1.5 when the costing is a bit more like 2.5, Mr Speaker. And so if they're saying now, as they're interjecting across the table, that they included that, then they got their costing wrong, Mr Speaker, and that's not the first time that they have done that, Mr Speaker. So the Shadow Treasurer asked me about the key difference. The key difference is that we are providing more relief. Now, when it comes to the budget position, again, another key difference between this side and that is the underlying cash position that the member for Hume took as the Shadow Treasurer to the last election had an $11 billion bigger deficit this year than what we had, Mr Speaker, and he's now pretending.
Order. The Treasurer will just take a pause. The member for Lingiari is now warned also. Order. The manager on a point of order.
Thanks, Speaker, and it goes to direct relevance. The question was straightforward. Is there offsets or not? That was the question.
Resume your seat. I'd like to hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the Manager of Opposition Business should know what was asked. This question specifically asked about coalition policy. We don't often get a question from that side that refers specifically to coalition policy. This one did.
I want to uphold what the Leaders of the House has said, and I've got a direct transcript here of the question that says about the government following the coalition. So if you're going to ask about the coalition— Order! I don't need any help from people on my right, but if you're going to ask about coalition policy in your question, whether the government has followed it, it is obvious. So just ask the manager in future just to make sure that he's also listening to the question. So, no, the Treasurer— Order. The Treasurer is going to respond to the question and he's being directly relevant. So he'll continue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about the differences between the two approaches. We're providing more relief, and because we've got a much better budget position than those opposite took to the election, we're providing it in a more responsible way, Mr Speaker. We found $114 billion worth of offsets in less than 4 years, which is the kind of responsible economic management which would be unrecognisable to those opposite, Mr Speaker. Now, when it comes to additional savings in the budget, we're at the end of March now. The budget is in the second week of May, and we'll continue to work through all of those decisions and deliberations in the considered and methodical but decisive way that has been a hallmark of the responsible economic management under this government, Mr Speaker, for some years. Now, what this is really about is about providing temporary and timely and responsible cost of living relief to people who are doing it tough. And we know that this war in the Middle East is having extreme consequences for the global economy, and Australians are paying a hefty price for that at the Bowser. And we're doing what this government always does, which is to try and help where we can, to try and provide cost of living relief in the most responsible way that we can. If those opposite really cared about cost of living relief, they wouldn't have opposed our tax cuts or said that they'd repeal them if they'd won the election.
Give the call to the member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. With the war in the Middle East impacting global supply chains, how's the Albanese Labor government taking further action to strengthen Australia's fuel security?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and the Minister for Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question and thank her for the wonderful work she does for the people of Macquarie on so many levels, Mr Speaker. And on Saturday, as I do every Saturday now, released the minimum stock obligation updated figures, so the Australian people can see how much petrol, diesel and jet fuel we have in Australia. And those figures showed 39 days' worth of petrol at 1.6 billion litres, 30 days of diesel at 2.7 billion litres and 30 days of jet fuel at about 800 million litres. And what that tells me, Mr Speaker, is that although our refiners and our importers are delivering fuel to regional Australia in particular at record levels, the fuel also continues to arrive in Australia and be refined in Australia. Viva, for example, Mr Speaker, which is the refinery in Geelong, has advised me today that their deliveries to regional Australia in the last week are 55% higher than normal. That's a good thing. They are prioritising deliveries direct to distributors who go to farmers and who go to those who are involved in agriculture, and that's a good thing, Mr Speaker. There's a lot more work to do. There's a lot more work to do. I would have thought those members opposite would welcome the fact that 55% higher deliveries, for example, to regional Australia. But we know that there's more to do. And last week, several companies raised with me the fact that the volatility in the oil market was getting worse, that purchasing spot cargoes was getting riskier, and that they were finding those transactions increasingly hard. So the government very quickly worked through those issues last week, and on Saturday the Prime Minister and I announced a major intervention to put Export Finance Australia to work, to enable them to finance and to work with importers to ensure they can get those cargoes, those spot cargoes that are available in the world. They are available.
Order. The member for Maranoa is going to cease interjecting.
We want them to come to Australia for Australians. So the Export Finance Australia will be able to enter into insurance, to hedging, to loans, to guarantees, direct purchases, whatever it takes to work with those companies to get those types of fuel into Australia, but not just fuel. Mr Speaker, the legislation which I introduced to the House today makes clear it is also available for any good suffering under supply chain disruptions, and the government makes it clear we regard fertiliser as a key priority there, and I thank the Agriculture Minister for all her work there with the sector. This is being ahead of the curve to make sure that we are helping companies before the problems arise. The companies told us that they were finding this increasingly difficult, so we announced the legislation on Saturday, introduced it on Monday, and will seek to pass it this evening, Mr Speaker, and we'll seek it through the Senate tomorrow, so we can see Australia's importers be able to get that fuel that is available around the world for Australians in good time, in good order, so we can ensure that our fuel supply remains as secure as it can.
Before I call the member for Kooyong, I have a few acknowledgements to do today for guests in the gallery. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the front row of the gallery today are the hard-working firefighters from the great state of Victoria joining us today. I'm also pleased to inform the House that in the gallery today is Mr Alex Volkavensko, the current and two-time UFC featherweight champion and the first Australian-born fighter to win a UFC title. We have members of the brand-new members, some of the brand-new members of the National Youth Parliament, Councillor Matt Burnett and the Mayor of Gladstone Regional Council and members of the Local Government Association of Queensland. I'm also pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is Ms Karen Lloyd AM, the former Executive Officer of Deaf Australia from 2000 to 2013. I give a call to the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Treasurer, you've directed the ACCC to crack down on fuel price gouging. But price gouging is not illegal in Australia. Prices are set by retailers, and drivers are still angry about getting ripped off at the Bowser. You're cutting excises, but how can drivers be sure that retailers will cut prices?
Give a call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll come to the member for Kooyong's question, but the Deputy Prime Minister is from a fighting family and he'll want me to say hello to the Volk, who's up there in the crowd. Thank you for joining us today. Mr Speaker, this is obviously a very important question that the member for Kooyong asks, because it goes to our efforts to make sure that fuel suppliers and retailers aren't doing the wrong thing by Australian motorists and Australian truckies, and that's why we have substantially increased the powers of the ACCC and the penalties of the ACCC so that they can come down like a ton of bricks on anyone who is doing the wrong thing in our fuel markets. And in doing that, we're coming after the sources of some of that gouging that the member is right to be concerned about. And so when we came to office, we increased the penalties. We allowed the ACCC to issue on-the-spot fines. Just recently in the Parliament, we passed the increased penalties further to up to $100 million, and that's because we share the concerns which are legitimately raised from time to time that at a time of extraordinary price volatility in global oil markets and Australian petrol markets, the onus is on us to prevent the kind of gouging that the member for Kooyong is talking about. Similarly, I've just actually signed a letter in the last half an hour or so to make sure that the ACCC is particularly attentive to the change that we announced this afternoon, to make sure that the benefits of the change to the fuel excise are passed on to Australian motorists and truckies, to make sure that they're doing the right thing there as well. And so it's an important question, a big part of the work that we're doing, not the only part of the work that we're doing, but to make sure the ACCC can look after the interests of our motorists and truckies.
Call to the honourable member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to support the transport industry and address fuel disruptions?
The call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thanks very much. And can I thank the member for Spence for his question, but also for his continued advocacy for transport workers. We do understand that Australians are doing it tough right now, and we're working around the clock to address domestic fuel disruptions that are occurring because of the war in the Middle East. This morning, led by the Prime Minister, National Cabinet met again to ensure a nationally coordinated approach to these fuel disruptions. Following this, the government has announced that we are reducing the heavy vehicle road user charge to 0 for 3 months to help ease costs for truck companies who are carrying essential supplies right the way across the nation. This is something that they have called for, and it is an important measure alongside the cuts to fuel excise. If we had have just reduced fuel excise, as those opposite proposed, without the road user charge, it would have had a significant and material impact on our trucking and supply companies, because that is what they did last time, and they left a significant mess for us to clean up in relation to that. These measures will, of course, complement changes to the Fair Work Act to ensure truck drivers can quickly renegotiate their rates with Australia's major retailers. The government will also defer the next scheduled increase in the heavy vehicle road user charge by 6 months. We also raised with state and territories that their charges around registration, that they could also consider those as well. We know transport operators are feeling the pressure of rising fuel prices, and have told us that they're struggling at the moment to absorb that cost. Heavy vehicle operators will see a direct reduction at the bowser and cash flow relief through full access through the fuel tax credit. We, of course, have also halved the fuel excise on petrol and diesel for 3 months, and halving that will reduce the cost of fuel by 26.3 cents per litre. These changes in road user charging in particular have been called for by the Australian Trucking Association, Australian Livestock and Rural Transporters Association and the Bus Industry Confederation as well, that does so much work in our public transport system. Our government is taking strong action to secure our fuel supply, help people with cost of living and keep Australia moving. Just today, we've introduced legislation to underwrite the purchase of fuel, fertiliser and other essentials by the private sector, so we can secure more cargoes coming to Australia. And of course, this builds on the work we're doing right the way across government, releasing more petrol and diesel onto the market, working with our regional partners to shore up supply and trade of essential goods, getting fuel into regional and agricultural communities that are facing fuel disruptions. We are working right the way across government and across governments to get bipartisanship, united approach to address these fuel disruptions. We are working with industry, unions and supporting businesses, workers and their suppliers.
The call to the honourable member for Cook.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that 10% of service stations in New South Wales currently have no diesel, and how many service stations in Australia are currently without fuel?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Cook for his question. Indeed, there are supply issues for select petrol stations around Australia. We've acknowledged that. We've acknowledged that that's the case. The minister I'll ask him to add. But what we're doing is actually constructively working through everything that is possible to increase supply. Everything that is possible, whether that be what we did with changing fuel standards for both diesel and petrol, whether it's making sure that the 20% that we released goes to petrol stations, particularly in regional Australia, or whether it be the measure that we announced on Saturday with the Energy Minister. And not everyone on that side has been critical of it, it must be said. There are some that have recognised that there is a war going on and that there's an impact of that war, as most Australians understand directly. So, for example, one said about the measures that we've taken. Andrew Hastie, the Deputy Liberal Leader in the House of Representatives. There's the title for you.
Order. Order. Members, Members on my right, when the House, the member for Cornwall or the member for Melbourne will cease interjecting. The manager on a point of order.
A direct relevance, Speaker. This was a very specific question. Didn't ask for a compare and contrast with the coalition, nothing like that. It wanted a confirmation about fuel station in New South Wales, 10% not having diesel, and what other stations, service stations across Australia.
Yes, it was specific, and you're asking some facts and figures, and you'd like the yes, no, and all of those things. You should resume your seat. There's no point. Well, I'm about to give order. Order. The manager. Order. The leader of the opposition is not helping. Yeah. Order. The Prime Minister's asked specific questions about facts and figures. It was a narrow question. I can't compel him under the standing orders to answer those. Don't. The Leader of the Opposition, when I'm no, we're just going to continue on. The Prime Minister has the call.
I was asked a question about supply, and that's what I'm talking about. And I know that the Manager of Opposition Business mightn't object to me quoting positively the Deputy Liberal Leader, but I will. Because he went on to say yesterday, I think we need to be doing whatever we can to make sure that we have sufficient supply in this country. He went on to say, so in principle this makes sense. These are big and extraordinary powers, but we are in extraordinary times. I welcome the fact that there's someone over there who does recognise that these are extraordinary times and therefore there are challenges.
Order.
And the sort of question from the member for Cook who asked this question.
Order.
When you have supply pressures, there will be impacts of those supply pressures, and that is what is there, and that is what we are dealing with. But it isn't just some on those opposite who recognise the challenges which are there. Many in the business community that we're working with do the same, Mr. Speaker. And Andrew McKellar, the Chief Executive of ACCI, said yesterday, we think it's a very positive step. It sends the right signal. It will ensure that we can stand in the international marketplace and bid to get those stocks when they're available. That's a critical part of the supply challenge at the moment. So we're working on supply in order to deal with the challenge which not just we're facing, but the entire globe is facing out of the fact that there is a war in...
Give a call to the honourable member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government responding to the pressures Australians are facing as a consequence of the war in the Middle East?
Excellent.
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Big thank you to the member for Corangamite, not just for the question, but for the great job she does representing the people of the Surf Coast and the Bellarine in Victoria, a beautiful part of Australia. Mr. Speaker, the war in the Middle East is doing a great deal of damage to the global economy, and Australians are paying a hefty price for that at the petrol bowser and beyond when it comes to the upward pressure on prices. And what we've announced today are additional steps to try and ease some of the pressures that Australians are feeling as a consequence of that war in the Middle East. We have announced that we'll halve the fuel excise for 3 months from April and cut the heavy vehicle road user charge to zero. And that's all about helping with the cost of living in a timely way, a temporary way and in a responsible way, Mr. Speaker. It will reduce the excise on petrol and diesel by 26.3 cents a litre. Now, people are under cost of living pressure. We acknowledge that, but more than acknowledge that, we're acting on it today. We know that that pressure in this instance is coming from the war in the Middle East. We can't end that war, obviously, from an economic point of view. The end of the war can't come soon enough. But in the interim, we're taking a series of responsible, decisive steps to help Australians through a particularly difficult period. Now, what we're announcing today will reduce the cost of a 65-litre tank by around $19. And when it comes to the heavy vehicle road user charge, That will save drivers about $130 on a 400-litre tank and will help take some more of the pressure off the supply chain for food and other essentials. And so this government will always do what it responsibly can to help people with the cost of living to recognise the pressures that they're under and do what we can to help. Now, this is a really important part of our plan to respond to the impact of the war in the Middle East, but not the only part of our plan. I commend the ministerial colleagues for the work that is going into boosting supply and making sure the distribution networks are as strong as they can be, making sure that our domestic refineries are encouraged to create more fuel here, the work that we're doing on ACCC and monitoring, all of the work that's happening when it comes to engaging with our international partners. All of this is a really important part of our plan, but particularly the leadership that the Prime Minister showed today in bringing the state and territory leaders together to agree the plan for fuel security, which was released in the last hour or two. And I thank the state and territory premiers as well for the indications that they have given on GST relief. We will get through this, Mr Speaker, but we all need to work together and do our bit. The announcements we've made today are all about that.
The call to the honourable member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Kidney Support Network in Mackay says volunteer drivers are being forced off the road by the national fuel crisis, putting renal patients at risk of missing dialysis. Why is this Prime Minister always last to lead in a national crisis?
Order. Order. The Minister for Resources. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Dawson for his question. I want to acknowledge the work that our volunteers do, including the ones that he referred to. One of the things about our country is that we're defined by the way that we look after each other. And there's nowhere clearer than in the example that the member for Dawson gave. And that's one of the things that will get us through the pressures that are on right now as Australians looking after each other. That was one of the key elements of the National Fuel Security Plan. Not seeking to impose solutions on people, but saying that people should only take what they need so that fuel is available and so that people are able to continue to keep our economy going under what is global pressures which are on. Now, we understand, and I certainly understand, that people are doing it tough at the moment and that this is creating a great deal of anxiety out there. If you go to a petrol station and you can't fill up, it makes you anxious. And we rely upon, in a country like ours, so much our motor vehicles to get around, which is why we're saying in the fuel security plan, for example, if you can get to work on a train or a bus and that's convenient and therefore leave more fuel around, then that's a good thing. But we understand that not everyone can do that in our country, and particularly in regional communities, and that's precisely why we are doing that. Now, we're working as well across the board, and I note this from someone was talking yesterday, and they said there's very extensive coordination between business and government. There is a graduated approach that has been adopted, and we've seen government acting quickly to implement appropriate arrangements, including standing up the National Coordination Mechanism, meetings of the National Oil Supplies Emergency Committee, starting the National Cabinet process, the appointment of Anthea Harris as the Fuel Supply Task Force Coordinator, changes to fuel standards, release of reserves. These are all important and very worthwhile steps, and businesses are being closely consulted as government works through the options. Now, that was Andrew McKellar, the head of ACCI. What is happening is that overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions I can think of, are working together in the national interest. That's what we'll continue to do, including in the interests of the constituents of the member for Dawson, because we understand that these difficulties, which are global, which are global. We are not immune from the impact of this war in the Middle East, which is why we will continue to take strong action as we have.
Call to the honourable member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. What action has the Albanese government taken to secure fuel for our Australian Defence Force?
Call to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence.
Well, I thank the member for his question and acknowledge the incredible work that he is doing on behalf of his community on the Central Coast. The National Fuel Security Plan that the Prime Minister has just announced is a critical step in meeting this moment, because Australians are rightly anxious about the war in the Middle East, the impact that it is already having on fuel prices and supply and what it might mean for the future. And this is a challenge for Australia as it is for the world. And this plan addresses both price and supply. Now, last week the opposition was out suggesting that the Australian Defence Force was not able to train and to exercise, to hone its warfighting skills in the way it normally would because of a lack of fuel. Well, Mr Speaker, I would like to assure you that this is absolutely not true. And obviously now is not the time to be scaring people for partisan objectives. The Australian Defence Force is training as it always has, and in part because of the decisions that our government has taken. When we came to office back in 2022, we inherited from the Coalition a plan to invest $1 billion in our strategic fuel reserves for the Defence Force over the next 30 years, a plan that was wholly inadequate. And so, well before the events of the last month, very early on, we tripled this investment, brought the spending into the decade, which means that as of today, the strategic fuel reserves for the Defence Force are double what they were when we came to office back in 2022. And so, as a result, right now, exercise Kakadu is underway. This is the largest maritime exercise that our Defence Force undertakes every 2 years. It involves 5 Navy ships, 700 personnel, involves 18 other partner nations, and I can assure you, Mr Speaker, that this exercise is absolutely in full swing. The National Fuel Security Plan is absolutely vital to meet the challenge of this time, and because of the decisions of our government, we've been able to secure the strategic fuel reserves for our Defence Force so that the men and women of the ADF remain absolutely prepared to keep Australians safe.
Yeah. The call to the Leader of the Nationals in the House of Representatives.
Well, thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. The Victorian Farmers Federation President Brett Hosking has just released a statement in relation to farmers' access to fuel, and I quote, "Today's announcements contain no clarity on how fuel will be prioritised if the crisis deepens." Why is the Prime Minister always the last to lead in a national crisis?
The member for Bendigo and the member for Solomon are now warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the Leader of the National Party in the House, I think is the title at the moment.
Order.
I thank him for his question. And the National Fuel Security Plan outlines very clearly the stages that we're at. We're at stage 2, keeping Australia moving, and that's where we want to stay. But that doesn't mean that you don't plan for contingencies and that you don't be over-prepared for what may occur in the future. As we have said very clearly, 20% of our reserves have been released and they've been prioritised into those regional areas. The decision that we made on Saturday, which will allow for the purchase of additional fuels and included in that as well, in addition to that, allows for the purchase potentially of fertiliser should it be available anywhere, and making sure that private sector operators can invest over the odds, effectively, of what they would have before this war began on the international market. And I know the member really does know that there is an impact of the war in the Middle East, and that has led to an increase in prices, not just for oil but for fertiliser and other products as well, including PVC piping. There's a range of things that are related. Now, this will allow for the purchase to occur, and that's why it has been welcomed so strongly. Now, the issue of your leader in the other place, the actual leader of the National Party, who's in the Senate, said, obviously, our fuel prices will be impacted by the world price, is what they have.
Leader of the Nationals in the House and the Treasurer will
Senator Canavan, the actual leader of the Nationals, had to say. Another of the former leaders of the Nationals had this to say: people just need to calm themselves down. Yes, there's an issue with supply and distribution, but certainly we don't want to see a toilet roll situation, because it's one thing to hoard toilet rolls, it's another thing to hoard petrol. Now, I do want to give credit and a shout-out to the member for New England. He contacted me constructively on Friday. We had engagement on Saturday as well about actually coming up with solutions. I give credit where credit's due. My door is open and my phone is on for people who actually want to be constructive and work on the national interest. And I think it contrasts with the party that he used to belong to.
Before I call the member for Blair, I'm also pleased to inform the House that present, who just joined us in the gallery today, is a delegation from the Milano Cortina Paralympic Winter Games, including Ben Tudhope, the dual medalist winning silver in the snowboard cross and bronze in the bank slalom, Grant Mizens, OAM, the Paralympics Australia President and three-time Paralympian, and Ben Troy, Australian Paralympic Team Chef de Mission. Welcome to you all. Giving the call to the honourable member for Blair.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. How is the Albanese Labor government continuing to back Australia's trucking industry?
Call to the Minister for Employment and the Minister for Workplace Relations.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Blair for his question and his ongoing commitment to Australia's trucking industry and, of course, many of the truck drivers as well. Our road transport industry is vital to keeping our nation's economy moving. Without trucks and their drivers, the movement of essential supplies across Australia would stop. Now, we know that the conflict in the Middle East is putting pressure on Australians, including on Australia's transport industry and Australian truck drivers. And our government is taking practical measures to shield Australian households, Australian businesses from the worst of the impacts of the war in the Middle East, including our truck drivers. This, of course, includes the National Cabinet's National Fuel Security Plan and, of course, the announcement that our government will reduce the heavy vehicle charge to zero, halve the fuel excise for 3 months, and along with, of course, deferring the next scheduled increase in the heavy vehicle road user charge for 6 months. These measures are important to help reduce the cost for the trucking industries and owner-operators around the country. The Albanese Labor government is also taking action to ensure the cost pressures in relation to fuel are shared fairly throughout the transport industry supply chain. And that's why we have amended the Fair Work Act to enable the Fair Work Commission to respond more quickly to contract change order applications in time-sensitive circumstances. This is to ensure that trucking companies and owner-operators are not left to absorb the cost pressures on their own. This measure delivers a fair go for our transport industry. Now, this has been widely welcomed by transport industry representatives along with unions. This important legislation is currently before the Senate, and I would urge all senators to listen to the calls from truck drivers and the trucking industry and pass this legislation as a matter of urgency. Yeah. Peter Anderson, CEO of the Victorian Transport Association, who is in Parliament today, has called on to support this legislation and said this amendment will bring certainty and direct support to all road freight operators throughout Australia. Bikram, an owner-driver from Brisbane, said, and I quote, "We need this legislation." Australian Trucking Industry CEO Matthew Munro said the Senate must pass this bill as it stands before it rises for Easter. Our government is taking urgent action to support Australia's trucking industry, and our government will continue to take practical action for our trucking industry.
Call to the honourable member for McKellar.
My question is to the Treasurer. For too many young people and families, the dream of owning their own home has become nothing more than a pipe dream. Housing tax concessions have tipped the playing field against first home buyers, causing growing intergenerational inequity. YouGov polling done in my electorate of McKellar and released today shows 62% support for reform of these housing tax concessions. Will the government commit to reforming our housing tax concessions to address worsening intergenerational inequity? Thank you.
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for McKellar for her question about a really important issue. The government hasn't changed its policy or position on the policies that the member raises in her question, but we do acknowledge there are intergenerational issues in our economy and in our society, including in the housing market and in the tax system. And that's why, when it comes to housing, we're spending so much time and money and effort trying to build more homes, playing catch-up after a decade of neglect through the good work of the Housing Minister to try and build more homes so that there are more options for young people in the housing market. Also, the 5% deposits are about trying to make sure that more people can get a toehold in a difficult housing market. And in the tax system as well, one of the reasons why we have provided the 3 tax cuts that we are providing in the way that we are is so that younger workers, and often on lower incomes at the start of their career, get a tax cut. That wouldn't have been the case had we left those original tax cuts undisturbed, and it wouldn't have been the case if those opposite had won the election and repealed our tax cuts. Also, when it comes to the intergenerational issues, that was one of the motivations behind the changes that we made to superannuation. Making superannuation fairer from top to bottom was all about making sure that the tax concessions were fairer for people who already had tens of millions of dollars in super, and we used some of the proceeds of that to boost the superannuation balances of people on lower incomes. I acknowledge the work of the Assistant Treasurer in that regard as well. And so we are working to address some of the intergenerational issues in the budget, in the economy and in our society more broadly. I agree with the honourable member who identifies housing and tax as 2 of the most important areas where those intergenerational issues are most easily observed. When it comes to further steps in tax policy or housing policy, the budget is still a little ways away yet, and any further changes would be a matter for Cabinet in the usual way.
Call to the honourable member for Moore.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emergency Management. How has the Albanese Labor government been delivering support to communities impacted by ex-tropical Cyclone Nurell?
Call to the Minister for Emergency Management, the Minister for Regional Development, the Minister for Local Government and the Minister for Territories.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moore. I know he's been watching the impacts of ex-tropical Cyclone Nurell closely as it's impacted his home state of WA. Ex-tropical Cyclone Nurell has, for the first time since 2005, impacted all 3 jurisdictions across the tropical north. For a number of communities, particularly in Queensland and the Northern Territory, Nurell has been a very unwelcome visitor in what has been a relentless season with repeated major floods already impacting a number of communities. Mr Speaker, Nurell first made landfall near Cowan in Queensland on the eastern side of the Cape as a Category 4 system, and of course that followed weeks of flooding across the north and northwest related to a monsoon trough and ex-tropical cyclone Koji. It follows extensive flooding in Daly River and Katherine, which is still ongoing. And our governments work really closely with both the Northern Territory and the Queensland governments to activate disaster recovery funding arrangements really quickly to get support where it needs to go. Personal hardship payments are available in Queensland and the NT across a number of areas. But over the weekend, Western Australia felt the brunt of ex-tropical cyclone Nurell. The system made its way down the Pilbara coast, bringing wind gusts of 250 kilometres an hour and over 350 mils of rain in Exmouth. We know already a number of homes are without roofs in Exmouth, power is intermittent, lines are down and trees have been uprooted. The impacts to the Ningaloo Reef are also devastating. But clean-up is underway and further impact assessments are being made. Learmonth Airport remains restricted to emergency services only, and the ADF through RAF Base Learmonth is supporting those operations due to damage and debris to the civilian aerodrome. My colleague, the member for Fremantle, and the Assistant Minister for Emergency Management will be on the ground today with Premier Cook, and we've been working closely with the WA government as this event unfolded. I've been in contact with my WA counterpart, Minister Papalia, to offer support and assistance, and I've also been in contact with the member for Durack to offer support as well. Today, we have enacted our disaster recovery funding arrangements with the WA government to provide support to those impacted communities. The shires of Exmouth, Carnarvon and Shark Bay will be eligible for recovery assistance measures, including emergency assistance for eligible individuals and families to meet their immediate and essential needs, including to replace essential household items and to support minor repairs to their homes. Residents will also have access to wellbeing services, and we stand ready to assist further following additional impact assessments. Mr Speaker, the impacts of ex-tropical cyclone Nurell have been incredibly destructive across Australia's north and west coasts, and we'll continue to work closely with all state and territory governments as we move through response to the recovery phase. And, Mr Speaker, can I just add my sentiments to yours? There are some legends in the gallery today. Ben Tudorhope, who gives Australia hope on the world stage. The group at Tribe Brewery, who are a corporate company providing support to families when they need it most, and to our firefighters from Victoria, first responders who go in to assist communities when they need it most. Thank you very much.
To associate with the Minister, the member for Maranoa.
Speaker, on behalf of the opposition, can I genuinely thank the Minister for her efforts in coordinating across 3 jurisdictions. Across my home state of Queensland, I know both the Queensland Government and Northern Territory Government, from contact I've had, genuinely appreciate your forward-leaning attitude towards making sure that the disaster has been appropriately dealt with. And I know in Western Australia, from talking to the member for Durack, how quickly we were to reach out on that. And to our first responders who are here today, we should never forget that in a society where we always talk about heroes being on social media, let me tell you, the men and women who put uniforms on and prepared to defend us and protect us in our hour of need are the real heroes. So thank you.
Give a call to the member for Monash.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The CEO of Ageing Australia, Tom Simonson, has said that due to the national fuel crisis, we are seeing an increase in workers not taking up shifts. Mr Speaker, why is the Prime Minister always the last to lead in a national crisis?
Good question. Very tough.
Order. Order. The member for Bowman. Order. The Minister for Social Services. When the House comes to order, Prime Minister will have the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question. What we have done is to convene National Cabinet for a second time today. We'll continue to meet. We've agreed a national fuel security plan with premiers and chief ministers. We've announced halving the fuel excise for 3 months, reducing the cost of fuel. We've announced a reduction of the heavy vehicle road user charge to zero, and deferred the next increase by 6 months. We've introduced new legislation today so the Commonwealth can underwrite shiploads of fuel, fertiliser and other essentials. This is something that is an unprecedented action which we have taken, and that comes after the other measures that we've taken. The laws to the Fair Work Commission that the Minister just spoke about, demanding that companies pay truckies fairly when fuel prices spike. The new laws to double penalties for petrol companies for price gouging. We've begun the release of 20% of Australia's fuel reserves. We've changed petrol and diesel standards so there can be more fuel flowing into our market. We appointed a National Fuel Supply Task Force coordinator. That group, with state and territory equivalents, has met twice and will meet twice weekly. We've tasked the ACCC to ramp up fuel price monitoring and to issue on-the-spot fines. We've made it easier for Australia's refineries to access government funding when they run at a loss. We've engaged with international partners to keep supplies flowing, including the joint statement I made with Singapore, but we've also engaged with leaders in Singapore, Malaysia, Korea, China, all of our international partners. We've engaged with states and territories on supply and distribution, including through the Energy Ministers' meeting that's been convened. We've activated the National Coordination Mechanism, which has met twice. We've unlocked $2 million in financial counselling funding for impacted farmers, and will continue to do what we can in circumstances which are real. You can't just wish away the impact of a war in the Middle East that has seen global fuel supplies be reduced. But we've continued to act each and every day, and some have been cooperative and supportive, and I want to give a shout-out to industry in particular we've worked with, and state and territory governments across the political spectrum today were productive as well. But had we not had the largest fuel reserves in 15 years, had we continued to have our fuel reserves in the United States rather than here, the predicament would have been far worse.
Time has concluded. The call to the honourable member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources and Northern Australia. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering on its commitment to implement a critical minerals strategic reserve to create secure jobs and to diversify our global supply chains?
Give a call to the Minister for Resources and the Minister for Northern Australia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Hasluck for her question. Just like everyone on this side of the chamber, the member for Hasluck knows the very real value of critical minerals to our national resilience and our national prosperity. These are minerals that are vital for renewable energy, defence technology and advanced manufacturing. Not just EVs and iPhones and laptops, but also radar systems, night vision systems, submarines and advanced weapons. From day one of this government, the Albanese Labor government has been cementing Australia at the centre of global efforts to diversify critical minerals supply chains. As the true party of the Australian resources sector, we are developing our resources, we are developing our regions, building a future made in Australia and creating secure jobs here at home. Today, Mr Speaker, the Albanese Labor government is delivering the election commitment to deliver a landmark $1.2 billion critical minerals strategic reserve. The bill that was introduced earlier today will make the critical minerals reserve operational well ahead of schedule, while at the same time securing that all-important liquid fuel and other commodities in that wider strategic reserve. And I thank the Minister for Climate Change and Energy for the work him and his team have done in relation to the strategic reserve. For the critical minerals part of this reserve, it will allow us to immediately bring forward the great body of work we have commenced with partners like the United States, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Canada and the European Union. Export Finance Australia will have a suite of new financial tools, including off-takes agreements with fixed or floating prices, to enable new projects to get off the ground, providing much-needed price certainty and, really importantly, more jobs right across the country in critical minerals. Mr Speaker, this government is making the most of our amazing geology and our committed resources workers and our committed resources sector by making more things here. It will strengthen our ability to collaborate with international partners and the private sector to diversify global supply chains. We are turning our unique geology to advance the national interest. We will initially focus on antimony, gallium and rare earth elements, all needed for national resilience and our national security. I agree with the United States Vice President when he said the international market for critical minerals is failing, driven by forces beyond any individual country's control. This critical minerals strategic reserve helps us take back control of Australia's critical minerals so we can construct deals and trading arrangements from a position of strength and in the national interest. I know the opposition have said they'll support the strategic reserve. They failed to support production tax credits for critical minerals, so I hope their support of this really important initiative holds.
The call to the member for Mayo.
Question is to the Minister for Aged Care and Seniors. Recent Senate estimates reveal that between the 1st of November 2025 and 23rd January 2026, 414 older Australians appealed their support at home package. The department then advised at estimates that just 2 of those 414 appeals were reviewed over a 7-week period. Does the minister believe that just 2 reviews over that time frame is acceptable?
Call to the Minister for Aged Care and the Minister for Seniors.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question. I believe it relates to the integrated assessment tool and the process of review that is in place. And I'd like to take the opportunity to clear a couple of things up for the member. Firstly, all of the assessments that are completed under the integrated assessment tool, or using the integrated assessment tool rather, under the single assessment system are completed by qualified human assessors with clinical input documented from start to finish. It's about making sure that we've got an assessment process that is efficient, accurate and fair, so that no matter where you live in Australia or who comes to do the assessment, everybody is treated equitably. Since November, we've completed 180,000 assessments. In terms of the review process, which is in place, there's been requests for review of less than 0.5% of those 180,000 assessments. Again, when we have a system that needs to be accurate, efficient and fair, we need to make sure that we can complete those assessments in a reasonable amount of time. Under the old system, people were in some cases being left to wait for up to 10 months in order to get their assessment completed. And by the time the old system completed or finished up, we had about $4 billion in unspent funds sitting within people's accounts. We now have assessment times consistently, Mr Speaker, under a month for median assessment times. So again, at every turn, we have sought to implement a system that is fairer for older people, that is accurate and efficient, and will continue to do so.
The Minister's concluded his answer. Good call to the member for Patterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. What actions is the Albanese Labor government taking to support our farmers and producers to help manage the disruption from the conflict in the Middle East?
The call to the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank our fabulous member for Patterson. And of course, for those of you that know, she did chair a critical report into our food security, which is really coming to the fore in the current climate in which we find ourselves dealing with this impact of this conflict in the Middle East. And of course, she understands just how important it is. And we have been laser-focused, our government, on helping our farmers, our fishers and our producers to help manage the impacts of the conflict in the Middle East. As we've heard, this conflict is impacting globally, and that includes here in Australia. And of course, front of mind for industry here in Australia has been the inputs of fertiliser and fuel, which we know are critical to our food production. And we know there's been challenges around the demand of these, which of course comes on top of some of the difficult weather conditions that our farmers have been dealing with in some parts of the country. But today's endorsement of a national fuel security plan by National Cabinet will deliver a coordinated and consistent response across the country to support all Australians, including our farmers, fishers and producers. We've also heard, of course, from our Prime Minister and the Minister for Energy that our government has announced that we'll work with industry to help to be able to underwrite the purchase of fuel and, importantly, also fertiliser by the private sector to deal with some of these challenges. This will support our suppliers to secure additional supply. And, of course, the announcement today in terms of the fuel excise reduction, the heavy vehicle road user charge reduction, and, of course, it builds on our appointment of the Fuel Supply Task Force and the coordinator to drive fuel distribution, which we know has been impacted in the regions. We're, of course, releasing up to 20% of our fuel reserves to help address this regional shortage and adjusting fuel and diesel standards to help bring more fuel into the market, particularly into regions. We've also tasked the National Food Council to concentrate on the conflict in the Middle East, and we've commissioned a national food supply chain assessment with the initial report on diesel supply due to me within the month. And we know that a large portion of our fertiliser supply, including urea, comes from the Middle East. That's why we're working with Fertiliser Australia, the National Farmers Federation, other industry bodies and right across our government to closely monitor the fertiliser supplies and to coordinate alternative supply options. We're working right across government, but also with countries in our region to help secure this additional supply of fertiliser. We're also strengthening our biosecurity processes to manage the risks and allow the prioritisation of fertiliser cargoes at our border to make sure that if we're getting it from alternative places, that we get it into the country quickly. We're using all of the levers available to us to help shield our farmers, our fishers and our regional communities from the impact of the conflict in the Middle East. And I'm continuing to meet with farmers and fishers and producers to manage this, and I particularly want to thank them for how constructive they've been in engaging with the government and for their suggestions and the work they're doing with us.
Call to the honourable member for Grey.
To the Prime Minister. Farmer Josh from Elliston in my electorate has texted me in desperation. He told me, quote, I'm still currently waiting on fuel, and if I don't get some in the next 10 days, with growing season approaching and rain forecast, it will cost our business in the long run. Will the Prime Minister be upfront with the Australian people and inform them of how many service stations are out of fuel?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question. The first thing I do is say to the member, if he gives me Josh's number, he's just texted you, I'm happy to personally have a discussion with him and do what I can to help him, because that's what we do. And that's what...
Order. Member for Bowman. Order. Order. Members on my left. The Prime Minister is responding directly to the question.
And that is what some members opposite have done, it must be said, because we're a government that get things done and want to make a difference. And your current leader says, "Oh, they've suffered enough." Well, you either want to help this guy or not. And if you want to help him, give us the info. We'll follow it up and do what we can. Give us the number and we'll follow it up. I want to make this point as well, because I'm asked about leadership by those opposite all during question time, and there's a big difference between what those opposite have suggested and what we have done today. We've worked constructively on supply with states and territories. We've worked constructively with industry. We've put out a national fuel security plan. We have, when it comes to the measures to assist with cost of living as well, by doing it through the National Cabinet process, we've ensured that states and territories have agreed that they shouldn't get a windfall gain, and what that will mean is a further reduction in the price of fuel.
Order. The Prime Minister will pause. The Manager on a point of order.
The Prime Minister is now answering a question which he said goes to direct relevance. It goes to direct relevance.
You need to state the point of order quickly.
Yeah, it goes to direct relevance. Yep. The Prime Minister is answering a question which was asked 2 or 3 questions ago. This was about how many fuel stations are currently out of fuel. Why won't you be upfront about it?
The Prime Minister was asked a question about a number, and he was, I can't compel him to do that. What I can compel him to do is to be directly relevant, and half of the answer has been about the person individually involved regarding a text message, and the Prime Minister saying, being upfront about to that member is pretty direct and pretty relevant. I don't think it could be anything more relevant. And I'm just going to make sure if he's answering the question, reading quotes, he's going to be directly relevant to what he was asked about.
Right, Mr Speaker. And I'm asked about supply for this individual, and I've asked for the number so that we can engage with the person concerned, Josh. But I've also, on supply, the Australian Institute of Petroleum, Malcolm Roberts, not the senator, the other one, the CEO, said this on Saturday in response to our initiative. While the flow of fuel into Australia continues uninterrupted, it is prudent for industry and government to secure additional medium-term supply in the event that the conflict in the Middle East continues for weeks or even months. Support from Export Finance Australia will help secure more spot cargoes for Australia as added insurance in uncertain times. The changes announced represent sensible risk-sharing between industry and government. They will strengthen medium-term fuel security. That's an example of the response of industry, who knows something about these issues, when it comes to the measures that we have taken to secure supply into Australia in the context of a Middle East war.
Conclude. Give a call to the honourable member for Maribyrnong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. How is the Albanese Labor government working to keep our children safe from child sexual abuse and strengthen justice outcomes for victims and survivors?
Call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her very important question. Every child has the right to be safe from sexual abuse. There wouldn't be a member of this chamber or a decent Australian who is not sickened by reports of horrific crimes against our children. The perpetrators of this abuse are despicable and they must be stopped. Preventing child sexual abuse and protecting our most vulnerable requires a collective effort, and our government is tackling this issue on a number of fronts. Last week, the Assistant Treasurer introduced landmark law to help those who've experienced child sexual abuse to access the compensation they deserve, preventing convicted abusers from hiding their assets in superannuation. I thank the victim survivors who advocated so strongly for these protections. They've played a critical role in shaping this legislation. In my portfolio, we are delivering reforms to working with children checks so that our systems are stronger, more reliable and more consistent across the country. And if you're banned from holding a working with children check in one jurisdiction, you are banned in all. I am pleased to update the House that 7 out of 8 jurisdictions across Australia have now legislated these reforms, and the final 1 jurisdiction has introduced legislation that is expected to pass in the coming months. Now, Mr Speaker, 30 years ago, the nature of matters prosecuted by the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions was very different. Today, concerningly, the most prevalent offences are for child sex exploitation, with 1,500 proven offences in 2024-25. Every member of this House would agree that the best outcome is to prevent abuse and stop it before it occurs. One Talk at a Time is Australia's first national awareness-raising campaign aimed at preventing child sexual abuse. It encourages adults with young people in their lives to learn about the issues and have ongoing, proactive, preventative conversations. Where abuse does occur, we must ensure that offenders are caught and convicted. This means backing our law enforcement agencies and the CDPP with the tools that they need to do their jobs. And that's why the Albanese government has delivered $35 million in increased funding for the CDPP, enabling more successful prosecutions to occur. And we must support victims which is why we've delivered a $12.2 million grant program to organisations that support children who've suffered sexual abuse and who are themselves displaying harmful sexual behaviours. Whether it's strengthening deterrence and offences or backing our law enforcement agencies and responding to new online harms, we'll keep working to protect children from this abhorrent behaviour.
The difficulty I have with that is people from the opposition were interjecting right throughout that answer. So in this time, I'm not inclined to grant indulgence. If the member for Fisher was interjecting non-stop during that answer, I didn't want to interrupt the minister due to the sensitive topic. That is not how indulgence worked. The member for Maranoa showed how that worked, and in this case, I'm not prepared to offer that to the House. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask further questions to be placed on the notice paper.